I was halfway through fixing the latch on my dog kennels when I saw the devil herself coming down the sidewalk with a clipboard and orthopedic shoes. Marjorie, our HOA president, walked like the whole neighborhood had been left to her in somebody's will, chin-up lips, pinched eyes, locked on my backyard like she'd finally found the crime scene she'd been praying for. The second I saw her, I knew my peaceful afternoon was dead. That woman never came over to say hello, never came over with good news, never came over for anything that didn't involve making somebody else miserable. Since the day I moved in, she'd treated me like a personal project. First, my truck was too big for the driveway, then my fence was the wrong shade of brown, even though it was the exact same fence the previous owner had. Then she got worked up over my security cameras, like I was running a surveillance state instead of trying not to get robbed. So when she stopped outside my gate and tapped that clipboard against her palm, I already knew what was next. She'd found herself a new target. "Quentin, we need to talk." I wiped my hands on my jeans, looked at her through the fence, and said, "That sentence has never once led to anything good." Her face tightened like she'd bitten into something sour. "Your dog kennels are in violation of HOA regulations. They are an eyesore, they are a noise nuisance, and the board has decided they need to be removed by the end of the week." Now that right there would have been funny if she hadn't been serious. My kennels sat clean and solid along the back fence, shaded, freshly painted, better maintained than half the flower beds in this neighborhood. My dogs were well trained too, Duke, my Great Dane, plus 2 shepherds and an old yellow lab who mostly slept and judged people. The neighborhood kids loved those dogs. Half my neighbors had met me because they'd stopped by the fence to pet them. So I crossed my arms and said, "Really?" Because nobody had a problem with them until you ran out of other things to complain about. She gave me that fake smile of hers, the one that always looked like it hurt to hold. "We've received numerous complaints." "From who?" "That's beside the point." "No, that is the point." Her eye twitched. I noticed because Marjorie was one of those women who thought she hid anger well, but her face always leaked the truth. "The kennels will be removed," she said, "or you'll be fined." I laughed, short and mean. "You remember the court order, right?" That wiped the smile clean off her face. A few months earlier, I'd taken the HOA to court after Marjorie and her little board had tried to fine me over a pile of nonsense so petty it sounded made up when I said it out loud. The judge had clearly seen what was happening: selective enforcement, harassment, intimidation, and ruled in my favor. Better than that, he issued an order barring the board from targeting me with bogus violations. Marjorie had taken that ruling like a personal insult, like the legal system had somehow betrayed her divine right to snoop and threaten. She leaned closer to the fence. "You think that piece of paper protects you forever?" "No," I said. "What protects me is the fact that you keep doing dumb things in broad daylight." That's when Duke let out a low, thunder-deep bark from inside the kennel. Marjorie jumped just a little, but enough for me to enjoy it. "Those animals are a menace," she snapped. I looked back at Duke, then at her. "Funny, he knows exactly where the property line is." She stormed off, muttering to herself, shoulder-stiff heels chopping at the sidewalk, and I stood there watching her go with that cold feeling you get when you know a crazy person just lost round 1 and is already planning round 2. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, before the coffee had even kicked in, Duke started growling in that deep way he had when something was wrong. Not excited, not playful wrong. I stepped outside and found a thick, rusted chain wrapped through the kennel gates, pulled tight and locked shut with a heavy padlock. For a second, I just stared at it. Morning light was hitting the metal, birds were chirping, sprinklers were ticking somewhere down the block, and there in the middle of all that suburban peace was a piece of pure malice. I dropped down beside the gate and checked the dogs. They were fine, just agitated, pacing, confused. My jaw locked so tight it hurt. Marjorie had gone from annoying tyrant to criminal idiot. I pulled out my phone and opened the security feed. Sure enough, around 3 in the morning, there she was, cardigan sensible, shoes, crazy eyes and all, sneaking into my yard with a chain in her hands like she was starring in the world's saddest burglary. She looped it through the kennel doors, clicked the padlock shut, then actually stood there admiring it for a second like Michelangelo stepping back from a ceiling. That was enough for me. I called the non-emergency line, explained what happened, then grabbed my bolt cutters from the garage. One clean snap and the chain dropped into the dirt. Duke came out first and stretched like he'd just been mildly inconvenienced by human stupidity. The other dogs followed, tails wagging, unaware that their freedom had become evidence. By the time the officer got there, I was standing by the fence with the chain at my feet and the footage ready on my phone. He watched the video once, then watched it again. Well, he said that's trespassing, vandalism, and depending on how this shakes out, possibly more. I said I'd also call it animal endangerment, but I'm flexible. He almost smiled. You want to press charges? Absolutely. Less than an hour later, the whole street got a free show. I heard shouting and walked out to see the officer on Marjorie's porch while she flailed her arms like a malfunctioning crossing guard. I was enforcing compliance, she barked. He's in violation of community standards. The officer didn't even blink. Ma'am, breaking into someone's yard in the middle of the night and padlocking his kennels is not HOA enforcement, it's criminal conduct. She actually tried pulling rank. As president of the HOA, I have the authority. No, you do not, he cut in. Especially not with a court order already in place. That shut her up. Not for long, but long enough. He handed her the citation, and the look on her face could have curdled paint. Then her eyes found me, standing down the street. I just gave her a little nod, not smug, not dramatic, just enough to let her know I'd seen the whole empire crack. By the next day, the neighborhood was buzzing. People who had spent years pretending not to notice her nonsense were suddenly finding their voices. Folks stood in little knots by their mailboxes, talking low, then not so low. Donna Donahue from next door, an older woman with a spine made of railroad steel, shut the door in Marjorie's face that afternoon when she tried going house to house with some made-up version of events. The Petersons, who usually stayed neutral about everything, walked away from her mid-sentence. You could feel the shift in the air. Fear was thinning out. Anger was replacing it. That night, the HOA emailed me a formal notice about a mandatory meeting to discuss my ongoing violations. I laughed so hard I had to set my phone down. They really thought the move after criminal charges was more paperwork. So I went. The community center was packed front rows full of Marjorie's usual loyalist people who liked having her around because her rules always seemed to bend around them. But the back rows were full too, and that was new. Real people, tired people. The kind who had kept quiet because they had jobs, kids' bills, bad knees, sick parents, all the stuff, life piles on, that makes fighting a petty dictator feel exhausting. Marjorie stood up front, shuffling papers like she was about to read from Holy Scripture. This community has rules for a reason, she announced, staring straight at me, and certain individuals seem to believe they are exempt. I let her go. Sometimes the best thing you can do is hand somebody a shovel and step back. She brought up my truck, my fence, my kennels, even my cameras. She talked herself hoarse, trying to turn me into some menace to suburban civilization. Then she finished, folded her hands, and waited for the room to absorb her brilliance. I stood up. I'd like to remind everybody, I said, that Marjorie is currently facing criminal charges for trespassing on my property and tampering with my dog kennels. So if we're discussing community problems, maybe we start there. The room went still. Then from the back, Mr. Thompson said, she fined me last week over a potted plant. Mrs. Peterson spoke next. She cited me for Halloween lights, but her nephew leaves a busted car parked out front for days. Another voice chimed in, then another, then another. It was like somebody had kicked open a dam. Suddenly, people were spilling years' worth of stories, selective fines, threats, weird little power plays, violations that appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as fast if you were one of Marjorie's favorites. That was the twist right there, the moment the whole thing changed. Up until then, she'd always made sure everyone felt isolated. She made each person think they were the only target, the only one catching heat, the only one too stubborn to comply. But sitting in that room, hearing all those voices stack on top of each other, people realized the truth at the same time. It was never about rules, it was about control. Marjorie looked stunned. Furious too, but stunned first, which I enjoyed. I held up my phone. I've got the court order right here. And if any of you have been dealing with the same kind of nonsense, start documenting everything. For once, she had no answer. Then came Greg. Greg was one of those board members you barely noticed, thin guy, quiet. Always looked like he'd accidentally wandered into the wrong meeting and stayed out of politeness. I'd assumed he was just another coward in a polo shirt. Turned out I was wrong. The next day, after Marjorie tried to have my truck towed using fake violation paperwork, yes, she really was dumb enough to do that, I went down to the HOA office ready for a fight. Instead, I found Greg sitting there alone, looking like he hadn't slept in 2 days. You here to yell at me? He asked. Depends, I said. You help order that tow truck? He rubbed his face. No. And for the record, some of us are real tired of cleaning up after her. That caught my attention. Greg leaned in and lowered his voice. There's an emergency board meeting tomorrow. Some of us are pushing for a vote to remove her. Now that I did not expect. Apparently, after the public disaster at the community center, board members had started panicking. Residents were demanding explanations. Emails were flooding in. Lawyers' names were being mentioned. Worst of all, for people like Marjorie, records were being requested. And records, it turned out, were exactly what she was afraid of. That night, I kept my cameras on. Around midnight, I caught her creeping near my fence again, flashlight in hand, moving toward the kennels like a raccoon with a grudge. I stepped onto the porch and lit her up with my own flashlight. "Really," I called. "You get cited for trespassing and decide to come back for extra credit." She froze, then stared at me with pure hate. Not annoyance, not indignation hate. The kind that comes from somebody finally realizing they're losing control. "Hope you like courtrooms," I said, holding up my phone. "Because I'm running out of patience and you're running out of luck." She turned and stormed off without a word. The emergency board meeting the next night felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like an execution. The room was packed wall to wall, and nobody had come for cookies and bylaws. Greg stood at the front, hands trembling just a little, and announced that the board would be voting on whether to remove Marjorie as HOA president for overreach, selective enforcement, and legal misconduct. She exploded. "This is an ambush," she shrieked. "I built this HOA. I kept order. I protected property values." A man from the back yelled, "You protected your friends." A woman near the front said, "You bullied everybody else." Greg called for the vote. One hand went up, then another, then a third, then a fourth. The room held its breath. And then the fifth hand rose. You ever hear a person realize in real time that their power is gone? It sounds strange. Half gasp, half choke, all ego. Marjorie made that sound. Greg swallowed hard and said, "As of this moment, you are no longer HOA president. You are to return all HOA property financial records and official documents by the end of the week." She looked around the room for anyone to save her. Nobody did. She grabbed her purse, shoved past a row of folding chairs, and slammed out the door, while Donna Donahue started clapping like she was at a church revival. Then the whole room joined in, and that should have been the end of it. But greed always leaves fingerprints. 2 days later, Greg came by my fence looking pale. "We started reviewing the accounts," he said. "There's money missing." Turns out Marjorie hadn't just been using the HOA as her personal crown, she'd been using it as an ATM. Fake maintenance invoices, inflated vendor charges, payments to companies that didn't exist. Little bites taken over years, small enough not to draw attention unless somebody really looked. That was why she'd been so desperate. Losing power was bad. Losing access to the books was worse. The next morning I found a note taped to my door in angry block letters. "You think this is over. You have no idea who you're dealing with." I took a picture, sent it to Greg, then added more cameras. That same night, just after midnight, I caught her digging through my trash bins with her phone flashlight, searching for God knows what. I stepped onto the porch and said, "Find anything interesting?" She spun around, dirt on her sleeves, eyes bright with panic and rage. "This neighborhood is falling apart without me," she snapped. I leaned on the railing. "No, Marjorie, it's finally breathing." She clenched her fists, looked like she wanted to lunge, then thought better of it and marched off into the dark. The next day, Greg called. The audit was complete. The evidence was solid. By the end of the week, Marjorie was charged with embezzlement, fraud, trespassing, and the rest of the mess she'd piled up trying to play queen of the cul-de-sac. And just like that, it was over. The neighborhood changed fast after that. It was strange at first how quiet peace can feel after living under nonsense for so long. People started talking on their porches again. Kids played outside without parents worrying some clipboard ghost would pop out of a shrub. The HOA under new leadership started handling actual community issues instead of launching holy wars over flower pots and fence stains. As for me, I got my yard back, my dogs got their peace back, and Duke went back to guarding the house from squirrels and bad decisions. Looking back now, the part that sticks with me isn't even the chain on the kennels or the tow truck or the screaming at meetings. It's how long people stayed quiet because they thought that was easier. That's the nasty little trick power plays on regular folks. It convinces decent people that speaking up will cost more than staying miserable. And sometimes that's true for a while, but silence has a price too. Usually somebody like Marjorie ends up collecting it. The hard lesson I learned is that people who hide behind rules rarely care about order, they care about obedience. And the moment you stop bowing, they show you exactly who they are. The last time I ever saw Marjorie, she was in the back seat of a car outside the courthouse, staring out the window like the whole world had betrayed her. No clipboard, no smile, no army of loyalists, no power. Just a woman, finally trapped by the mess she'd made. I won't lie, that felt good. Not because I enjoy watching people fall, but because every once in a while, karma stops taking its sweet time. So here's what I want to know. When somebody uses rules, titles, or authority to make other people afraid, At what point does standing up for yourself stop being resistance and start becoming a responsibility? And tell me, this too was justice enough, or did Marjorie deserve even more after everything she pulled? Drop your take, and if you've ever dealt with a petty tyrant, an HOA nightmare, or somebody drunk on a little bit of power, share your story too.
Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video.